So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, and since I assume you can all read, you can just read their names. They're lovely people, and they couldn't be here. Okay, so I'm going to go right through this to methods. So in this paper, we're looking at care work under the newly introduced National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia. And it's argued to be Australia's largest social reform since the introduction of universal national health care. So it's a big reform. It's a big package. And it was actually initiated by Labour, which is the contradictions of the Labour Party in Australia and everywhere else. Okay, so I'm aware that Australia is a very different context than Quebec, Canada, Ireland, the UK, Tunisia. So I'm going to try to contribute some insights and preliminary theory that could be useful perhaps in other contexts and countries. So in the past, most disability workers in Australia were employed in publicly funded, faith-based and non-profit organizations. So publicly funded, but still nominally non-profit organizations who provided group support and activity for people with disabilities. The NDIS replaces the block funding that agencies received with personalized funding to individuals, which in effect is a cash for care plan. Workers are no longer permanent employees of mid and large-sized organizations. Instead, they work often very short shifts of an hour or less in service users' private homes with little or no supervision or support, little knowledge of the service user's preferences or triggers. They are highly precarious, casualized, dispersed, and frustrated. The paper explores the ways that the current industrial relations regulatory landscape contains gaps that are being exploited by employers and by some service users who are frequently underfunded by government assessors, and hence they have an incentive to pay wages and set conditions below the award level set by the quasi-tripartite system of industrial relations in Australia. So though the NDIS was intended to introduce important human rights reforms, because it is ideologically tied to the private market and aggressively advances privatization of disability work, we argue that it introduces a zero-sum game in which the rights and protections of a highly gendered workforce are traded off against the human rights of some people with disabilities, namely those who can advocate for themselves or have a strong advocate. Okay, so here's my methods that you've been staring at. The important thing to take from this slide is that this was a qualitative study, and that the interviews took place in the early rollout zones. That's what they call them, early rollout, which the rest of the world might call pilot zones. So the NDIS has been piloted in these areas, and so the conditions in these regions are markedly different than the older system that continues to exist in the rest of the country, but that isn't in the process of changing. So we might say that what we're looking at here is what everyone can expect to happen. Okay, so in terms of theory, I'm going to move through quickly. So we draw on labor process theory, which is a meso-level theory analyzing the shifts in workplace power between management and workers. We use concept pro-market, non-market, which is a concept that I used in the past to analyze restructuring in Canadian nonprofit and public social services in the early 2000s. Restructuring was seen as pro-market in that it promoted, valorized, and legitimized private market relations, logics, and management models, but it was simultaneously non-market in that though the organizations continually had to rationalize and cut costs, they did not turn a profit or generate a surplus, so they remained nominally outside the market or non-market. And we replaced that concept with pro-market gig market to explain and explore the NDIS. This concept underscores a new shift in the way that governments advance private market relations and, in effect, market making. Gig economies are characterized by temporary employment, as we all know, where organizations exist primarily to interface between service users and short-term providers, and where workers are remade as independent contractors rather than employees. We use the term quasi-gig to underscore the similarities with the gig market, or on-demand labor market. The only significant difference we see from a gig economy is that not all disability workers have been remade as private contractors, though some have, particularly higher credentialed workers. And the last contribution that you might be able to apply in your regions is this notion of a zero-sum game, and we've just begun to explore this, but the NDIS fits with a number of other policy changes we see, in which the gains for one marginalized group have been made at the expense of other marginalized groups. So it's a trade-off. Thus, social policy under late neoliberalism, we might say, seems to resemble a poker game, which is the quintessential zero-sum game, in which the winnings of one or two people come from the losses of everyone else. Okay, here's our contacts. So prior to the NDIS, most disability work was covered by government award, which is this tripartite-like agreement that sets terms and wages for the sector, for the disability sector. Individual organizations often had a union or enterprise agreement above the award, and most people worked in collectively in mid or large-sized organizations with a reasonable level of density, union density. The NDIS, as I said, is a personalized funding package, and there's three options you can take with your personalized funding package. You can hire your own staff, and in this case, there's no requirement to use registered staff. So we actually know very little about the people who are working in this context, in the context where people hire their own staff, because there's no way to collect any data on them. And they're not necessarily following any kind of minimum wage requirements or minimum shift requirements, and certainly we suspect not the award requirements. Secondly, you can work with your own coordinator, and in that case only the coordinator needs to be registered, and then the coordinator will come under the award. The coordinator is encouraged to make sure that everyone they work with comes under the award, but again, there's no enforcement mechanism, there's no documentation collected. And the third option is to work with an NDIS service coordinator, in which case everybody has to be registered and presumably everybody follows the award, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have data yet on which options are the most popular, but we know that the hire your own staff, option one, is very popular with people with physical disabilities who can advocate for themselves. And we see more people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities in the second and third categories. We can see in this formulation that there's an incentive to pay low wages to unregistered casualized workers. It's not that people choosing option one and option two are bad people, although maybe some of them are, who knows. It's just that they need and want their funding packages to extend as far as possible. And without an impetus for fairness, wages are determined by the private market, not years of regulation. If we add to this, and this is a really important piece, the underpricing or underfunding of individualized packages that have been provided by the government and well documented in a recent study by Cortis et al., we can see the way that the government is setting the stage for a highly privatized sector characterized by fragmentation, low wages, and precarious work. So currently work in the pilot zones or the rollout regions. People find themselves working alone in people's private homes, and it's not possible to ensure whether these are safe workplaces or not. They work short shifts. Under the award, the disability workers, the minimum shift is 2 hours, but people can be hired as home care workers instead, and then the minimum requirement is 1 hour, and there are people who are pushing for 20-minute shifts because they say that's all they need and they don't want to pay more. People work in multiple work sites, people's private homes. They're often very dispersed. They have unpaid travel in between. They have extremely short notice of shifts. We had many workers telling us that they had 1 hour to 2 hours notice of a shift, and they dared not refuse shifts because they were always hustling for shifts. This is like where it's like a gig economy, and people, of course, experience lower wages. Okay, so I'm going to go through, hopefully, 4 thematic findings. So the first is our qualitative interviews with frontline workers. They had a very strong support for a generous interpretation of human rights for service users, but they had a very strong feeling and strong concerns that the people they worked with, who were largely people with intellectual disabilities, were experiencing isolation in their own homes as group activities wound down, lower quality of care seemed to predominate, and a revolving door of care workers existed. Thus, in essence, there was less choice, autonomy and human rights for this group of workers. And this is consistent with international literature on personalized funding packages, that people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities often fare worse under cash for care policies, while people with physical disabilities and those with strong advocates do better. So here's just a couple of exemplar quotes for you. You'll just have to speed read. Okay, I'm going on to the second one. Okay, so the second finding is that there's increased precarity and a gig-like economy working conditions. So as these quotes highlight, there's a great deal of stress and concern over these conditions. With the loss of block funding, organizations that once provided group care and support are rapidly remaking themselves as brokers between individually funded service users and workers, and coordinators of service packages, rather than actually being service providers. Characteristic of gig economies, as I said before, short notice of shifts, short shifts, multiple work sites, no travel time, lowered wages, and uncertainty are particularly disruptive. 5 minutes, okay. Third finding. So there's less training and skill in the workforce because the NDIS has generated a demand for disability workers, particularly home care workers. Workers described other workers the new workers as very, very green, low skilled, and they were concerned about their inexperience. So the story below is typical of the sector and highlights how inexperienced workers are put in positions where they don't have the skills to handle complex situations and unintentionally increase workplace conflict, lower the self-determination and dignity of service users, and put themselves in jeopardy. And as the last quote shows, these situations could be avoided with a bit of training and supervision. I spelled that, okay. Final finding, the challenges of working short shifts in private homes. These are some of the factors that people have to deal with. And as the quote here highlights, the constantly changing pool of on-demand workers can make for more hazardous work environments, as casual staff cannot possibly know the service users, their preferences, or triggers. So this is sort of normalizing violence and injury in the workplace, which is not unknown in this sector, but certainly not about to get better under these changing conditions. Okay, I won't do my little chart there. Instead, I'm going to go on to the conclusions, which are that the goal of this paper was to extend our understanding of labor process theory and precarity by adding these concepts of pro-market, gig market, to signal the shift from a non-market mandate that previously undergirded disability services. Instead, a pro-market gig market, in effect, creates markets and destabilizes permanent work, better working conditions, and better wages, replacing them with on-demand work and impermanence. A circumscribed vision of human rights played an ideological role in this process in convincing service users, the public, and workers to support the NDIS. But then what in fact happened is that the protections and regulations that defended workers were driven down. Though our conclusion is tentative at this point, based just on this example, it does appear that a zero-sum game exists, in which a few win and many lose, and this may be a feature of social policy change in market-driven contexts, such as the NDIS, and we might further conclude that further workplace protections mean little in the context of restructuring and marketization. I'm done. Did I finish early?
You did. You finished early.
Sorry, I didn't do my chart.